Today we're going through one of the most disturbing cases in Alabama's history. But first, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what exact time it is right now while you listen to this. We really want to know what places and what times of day or night these true stories reach. It all started with a crack in the foundation. That's what the old Montgomery County papers said back when someone checked out the Callaway mansion in 1859. Just a simple little building problem written down plainly by the county inspector. Decades after everything that really happened, stuff that historians would later piece together bit by bit. Nobody thought twice about why Elizabeth Callaway, a rich and well-known widow, wouldn't let inspectors into her house for almost 9 years. She kept saying her house was perfectly fine, even though her neighbors kept complaining about weird smells and strange noises. The mansion sat about 3 miles outside Prattville, Alabama, on a huge cotton plantation that used to be the pride of the whole area. But by 1859, you could tell the place was falling apart. The yard, once neat and tidy, was now covered in weeds, and the white columns were stained with mold. Nobody found that crack until after Elizabeth died, when her only living relative, a nephew from Boston, showed up to claim what she'd left him. What the inspectors found under that crack stayed a secret for almost 100 years. The nephew, Thomas Callaway, ordered everyone to keep it all hush-hush. He paid the local officials a lot of money, and within 2 weeks he was back in Boston, and he never set foot in Alabama again. The mansion got boarded up, the land got sold off bit by bit, and Elizabeth Callaway's story pretty much got forgotten. That is, until 1962, when a grad student from Tuskegee University who was studying old Southern buildings found a bunch of letters. They were among Thomas Callaway's things, which had been donated to a Massachusetts history museum after he died in 1891. Those letters talked about spaces that shouldn't have existed, sounds that came from nowhere, and a widow who said she was guided by a higher purpose that broke all the rules of her time and place. So what really happened at the Callaway mansion between 1850 and 1858? The old records give us stories that don't match up, missing pieces, and clues that don't fit with what people believed back then. This is the story people now call Alabama's Forgotten Sanctuary, though whether it was a safe place or a prison is a question that still echoes today. From what we know, Elizabeth Callaway was born Elizabeth Monroe in 1810, into a rich Charleston family with connections all over the South. When she married plantation owner James Callaway in 1830, everyone thought it was a great match. It mixed old Southern money with new farm money. James had inherited his dad's cotton plantation outside Prattville, and by 1840 he'd grown it to include over 100 enslaved people. Around town, the Callaways were known as generous hosts and devout Methodists, and back then, people supposedly saw them as kind slaveholders. But later, people who knew the real truth would question that good reputation, especially about what happened after James Callaway died in the winter of 1849. County records say James died of typhoid fever, but rumors kept going around that his death was sudden and pretty suspicious to the other plantation owners. At 39 years old, Elizabeth became the sole owner of the Callaway Plantation, which was unusual for a woman in Alabama back then. Even stranger, she fired the white overseer who had run the plantation's daily business for almost 15 years. According to old records kept in the Alabama State Archives, the plantation's cotton production dropped by almost 30% the year after James died. Even though Elizabeth's own money seemed just fine, in the summer of 1850, about 6 months after her husband died, she started fixing up the mansion. That renovation would later become the center of so many rumors. Bills show she bought huge amounts of wood, brick, and iron, some of it from as far away as Mobile. The workers she hired weren't even from Prattville. She brought them all the way from Montgomery, which was a strange and pricey choice. Even stranger, all the workers got let go after only 3 weeks. Elizabeth said the renovations were finished, even though the foreman's own records showed only the first part of the work had actually been done. What happened in the months after that has been pieced together from bits and pieces, entries in a household account book Elizabeth kept, letters with merchants in Montgomery and New Orleans, and the memories of a former house slave named Mercy. Mercy was interviewed in 1937 by a government worker, when she would have been over 90 years old. Some historians brush off her story as just the fuzzy memories of an old woman, but it actually matches perfectly with the physical evidence found during a 1965 dig at the mansion's ruins. According to Mercy, in the fall of 1850, Elizabeth started changing how the plantation worked in ways that confused and worried the neighboring plantation owners. Field workers got moved to different jobs for no clear reason. Several skilled enslaved workers, a blacksmith, a carpenter, and a mason, were reported as runaways, and ads were placed in the Prattville Progress newspaper offering rewards to bring them back. But months later, visitors said they saw those same people still on the property. Elizabeth would quickly brush it off, saying they were new workers who just happened to have similar skills. The biggest changes, though, happened inside the mansion itself. Elizabeth let go of all but 5 of her house slaves, sending the rest out to work in the fields. She turned the big dining room, once the place for fancy dinner parties for Prattville's high society, into her own private study, where people say she'd spend hours alone with the door locked. Deliveries showed up at night, carried in through the back door by the remaining house slaves, always under Elizabeth's watchful eye. And then there were the sounds. Mercy described them like the house itself was breathing underground. Church records from St. Mark's Episcopal Church show that Elizabeth stopped going to church in November of 1850, saying she was too sick. But merchants in Montgomery said they kept seeing her buying odd amounts of medical supplies, canned food, and fabric. A record from Blackwell's drugstore, saved by the Montgomery Historical Society, shows that in 1851 alone, Elizabeth bought enough painkillers, quinine, and bandages to stock a small hospital. When the pharmacist asked her about it, she supposedly said she was sending the supplies to cousins in Mississippi who'd fallen on hard times, but no record of any such cousins has ever turned up in the Monroe family's history. By 1852, rumors were spreading among the plantation-owning families of Autauga County. Elizabeth had almost completely pulled away from society, turning down invitations and barely seeing any visitors. The few people let into the mansion said they were only allowed in the front sitting room, with Elizabeth explaining that the rest of the house was being renovated or that she was sick and didn't want to spread anything. Several people noticed that certain doors, which used to lead to other parts of the house, seemed to have been sealed shut. When people asked her directly about the changes, Elizabeth would change the subject or say her grief over James's death had made her want to be alone and live simply. Even more worrying to her neighbors was how badly the plantation seemed to be run. While other cotton farms nearby were growing bigger to keep up with demand from mills up north and in England, the Callaway Plantation kept producing less and less. And yet there was no sign Elizabeth was running low on money. In fact, bank records from Montgomery show regular big money transfers coming into her account from places in Ohio and Pennsylvania, vaguely labeled as investment returns. In the spring of 1853, the first recorded disappearance connected to the Callaway Plantation happened. A young man named William Henson, who'd just come from Virginia to work as a tutor for a neighboring family, vanished after supposedly paying an afternoon visit to Elizabeth. His boss, Jonathan Prescott, who owned the plantation next door, wrote in his journal that Henson had been curious about the area's history and had planned to ask Elizabeth about local folklore. Henson never came back from that visit, and when Prescott asked Elizabeth about it, she said the young man had only stopped by briefly before mentioning he planned to travel to Mobile. No trace of William Henson was ever found, even though ads were placed in newspapers all across Alabama. If it had been just one strange event, people might have blamed it on the dangers of traveling through rural Alabama. But over the next 5 years, according to records collected by amateur historian Robert Daniels in his 1958 booklet, The Mysteries of Autauga County, at least 7 people went missing after having some kind of connection to the Callaway Plantation. These included a traveling salesman, a land surveyor who worked for the county, 2 abolitionists from Philadelphia who were passing through, and 3 enslaved people from nearby plantations who were first thought to have simply run off. In none of these cases was Elizabeth Callaway officially blamed. Each disappearance was investigated on its own by different people over a long stretch of time. It wasn't until decades later, when someone looked at all the records together, that the pattern showed up. Still, accounts from that time suggest that local people had already started to suspect the widow and her increasingly cut-off estate. A letter from Prattville Dr. Samuel Whitfield to his brother in Savannah, dated July 1855, shows he was worried about the widow, who had started acting strangely, the kind of strange that reminded people of old stories about women driven mad by grief. He wrote that he'd been called out to the plantation to treat what Elizabeth called a fever among her house staff, but she only let him examine one elderly enslaved man who actually showed signs of not having enough food rather than any real disease. Dr. Whitfield wrote that he heard sounds from behind locked doors that sounded like other people in distress, but Elizabeth firmly refused to let him see anyone else. She stood guard in front of the cellar door like a sentry, claiming it was unsafe because of recent flooding. This letter is the first written record we have of anything strange going on in the mansion's cellar, a space that would later become the main focus for investigators. The original building plans for the Callaway mansion, filed with the county back in 1828 when James's father built the house, show just a small root cellar, the normal kind for homes back then. But the 1965 archaeological dig found a whole complex of underground rooms stretching way beyond the house's foundation, built with surprisingly advanced techniques, including air vents disguised as garden decorations. By 1856, Elizabeth had cut herself off almost completely. Delivery records show that supplies were dropped off at the edge of the property, with payment collected by a single enslaved man who wouldn't say more than the bare minimum needed for the exchange. Most of the plantation's fields sat unused, with just enough cotton picked to make it look like a working farm. Yet lights were seen in the mansion's windows at all hours, and people traveling past on the road said they heard something like singing coming from the grounds late at night. It wasn't the kind of work songs enslaved field workers usually sang. It was something hymn-like, but in no language anyone could recognize. Then in December of 1856, something happened that would eventually start unraveling whatever Elizabeth Callaway had been doing at her mansion. A bad storm hit central Alabama, causing the Alabama River and its smaller streams to overflow. The creek along the eastern edge of the Callaway property flooded, and water backed up toward the mansion, which sat on a small hill. According to a story published in the Prattville Progress at the height of the storm, some poor white farmers living about a mile from the Callaway Plantation said they saw a line of figures, some of them carrying others, moving from the mansion toward some woods to the north. When the county sheriff asked Elizabeth about it, she said some of her field workers' cabins had flooded, so she'd sent the enslaved workers to shelter in the tobacco drying barn, which sat on higher ground. The sheriff accepted that explanation at the time, since he was busy dealing with flood damage all over the county. But land surveys clearly show the field workers' cabins were on ground about as high as the main house, so they shouldn't have flooded before the mansion itself would have been hit. Something even more telling turned up in 1960, a letter found among the personal papers of Reverend Josiah Willard, a Northern Methodist minister known for supporting the end of slavery, who had moved to Cincinnati after working as a traveling preacher in Alabama in the 1840s. The letter, dated February 1857, was written by Elizabeth Callaway herself, and it mentions people who were delivered safely to Willard's colleagues despite some unexpected trouble during their trip. She goes on to ask that future plans include backup options in case of natural disasters, saying that having to move people during the storm had put everyone at risk in ways that better planning could have avoided. This letter strongly suggests Elizabeth Callaway was part of the Underground Railroad, the secret network of routes and safe houses that helped enslaved Black people escape to free states in Canada. That would explain a lot of the strange things going on at the plantation. The drop in cotton production, since workers were being secretly moved north instead of working the fields, the renovations to build hidden spaces, the medicine and food supplies, the money coming in from northern states, and maybe even the disappearances if those people had either joined the escape network or, worse, found out about it and been silenced. But the physical evidence found under the mansion in 1965, along with certain entries in Elizabeth's personal journal, recovered from her nephew's belongings, paint a picture that's a lot more complicated and disturbing than just a simple stop on the road to freedom. The archaeological dig, done by a team from Auburn University, showed that the spaces under the Callaway mansion had been heavily built out to look like actual living quarters. These weren't just temporary hiding spots for people passing through on their way north. The rooms, which spread out in a maze-like way well beyond the house's foundation, showed clear signs that people had lived there a long time. Personal items found in the spaces included handmade toys, clothes that had been patched up again and again, and homemade furniture built from scrap wood. Most tellingly, the walls in several rooms were covered in tally marks, the kind used to count days, weeks, maybe even months or years. Elizabeth's journal, which covers January 1850 to November 1857, starts out as a normal diary of a plantation mistress's daily life, but it slowly turns into something much more troubling. The early entries show her grieving over James's death, but by late 1850, her writing becomes obsessed with what she calls my true calling and the souls in my keeping. She writes about hearing voices that guide her actions and having visions where the walls of the mansion open up to reveal rooms of sanctuary. Her religious language gets stronger and stronger. She keeps calling herself a tool of God's plan and calling the space under her home the Ark of Salvation in a flood of wickedness. The most disturbing entries come from 1854 and 1855, where Elizabeth writes about making hard choices for the greater good. She writes about people who could not be trusted with knowledge of the sanctuary and who now reside where they can cause no harm. These creepy lines line up with the disappearances that Robert Daniels documented, suggesting Elizabeth may have been responsible for what happened to those missing people. The journal also shows that Elizabeth was likely suffering from what today's doctors would call a serious mental illness, probably made worse by her isolation and the stress of her secret activities. She writes about talking to her dead husband, whose spirit, she claimed, told her to expand the underground rooms. She writes about going days without sleep, followed by intense hallucinations. By 1856, her handwriting gets messier and messier, and she starts writing about being paranoid that agents of evil are trying to discover her holy work. The most revealing and most disturbing part of the journal comes from early 1857, right after the flood. Elizabeth writes about conflict with the people she's sheltered, who she says are now ungrateful for being saved. She writes about using necessary discipline and locking people up for the protection of the unruly. One entry says, "They do not understand that freedom without preparation is a curse, not a blessing. They must remain under my guidance until their souls are ready for the journey, no matter how their bodies protest." These lines suggest that what may have started as helping with the Underground Railroad had, as Elizabeth's mental state got worse, turned into something very different. Instead of helping enslaved people escape to freedom, it looks like she was actually keeping them locked up in the spaces under her mansion, convinced that only she knew what was truly best for them. This idea is backed up by what Mercy, the former house slave, said in her 1937 interview. Mercy said that every evening, Elizabeth would go down into the underground rooms to preach to her congregation, bringing food and medicine, but also punishment for anyone who dared question her. Mercy said that the people who were first brought to the mansion with promises of a trip north eventually realized that no one ever actually left the mistress's protection, because Elizabeth was afraid the outside world would corrupt them. What really happened to the people locked under the Callaway mansion became clearer in the summer of 1858, when a long drought hit central Alabama. At first, people didn't believe Mercy's account because she was so old, but the physical evidence found later matched exactly what she described about the mistress's collection of souls kept under the house. Wells all over the region dried up and water became precious. Records from nearby plantations show that Elizabeth started making unusual requests to have water delivered to her property, and she was willing to pay huge amounts for it. When people questioned this, she said her own well had collapsed and that she needed the water for her household and for the few field workers she had left. This was also when local suspicion about the widow reached its peak. Jonathan Prescott, the neighboring plantation owner who had once employed the missing tutor William Henson, wrote in his journal that he'd seen smoke rising from the Callaway mansion at odd hours, even though Elizabeth had let her cook go months earlier. He also wrote about hearing sounds of distress, like many voices crying out at once, coming from the direction of the mansion on quiet nights. The turning point came in August 1858 when a fire broke out in one of the outbuildings on the Callaway property. The fire could be seen from Prattville, and several townspeople rode out to help. At first, Elizabeth wouldn't let them onto the property. She stood at the gate holding a shotgun, insisting she could handle it with her own people. It was only when the fire started spreading toward the fields of the Prescott Plantation next door that the sheriff was called in and forced his way onto the land. While the men were fighting the fire, which had spread to a storage barn near the main house, two of them said they heard cries for help coming from somewhere near the mansion. They left the firefighting to investigate and found that part of the ground behind the kitchen had caved in, revealing what looked like the entrance to a tunnel. Voices, several people calling for help, were coming from that opening. What happened next is written down in the sheriff's official report, filed in Autauga County on August 23, 1858. The men went into the tunnel and found a series of underground rooms. Inside, according to the carefully worded official report, they found 12 black people in various states of distress, some clearly showing signs of having been locked up for a long time. The sheriff's report doesn't give many details about their condition, other than saying they needed medical help and that the rooms they were found in weren't fit for people to live in, no proper airflow, no proper toilets. A more revealing account comes from a private letter, written by one of the men who went into the tunnels, now kept by the Alabama Department of Archives and History. In it, he describes rooms barely tall enough for a grown man to stand up straight in, with air so thick with the smell of human waste and sickness that he could barely breathe. He wrote about finding people chained to the walls in several rooms, others who could move around their small space but had no way to get out, and several who were too weak from sickness or hunger to even stand without help. Most disturbing of all, he says he found the remains of at least 3 people who had been dead for some time, their bodies arranged in a way that suggested some strange ritual or vigil had been held for them. When she was confronted with all this, Elizabeth Callaway reportedly showed no guilt or concern at all for the people found under her home. According to several accounts, she claimed God had personally put her in charge of protecting these souls from the outside world's corruption, and that the ones who had died had simply finished their time on earth and moved on to their reward. She insisted her actions came from Christian charity, saying she had rescued these people from far worse conditions and planned to eventually set them free once they were properly prepared through prayer and teaching. What happened right after these discoveries was handled very quietly. The survivors found under the mansion were spread out among several plantations in the county without much fuss. There's no record of any of them ever actually gaining their freedom. They simply vanish from the historical record, their fates unknown. Elizabeth Callaway was never publicly charged with any crime, which says a lot about how complicated people's attitudes toward slavery and mental illness were in Alabama before the Civil War. Instead, based on letters between the sheriff and Elizabeth's nephew Thomas Callaway in Boston, it was decided that Elizabeth would be sent to the Alabama State Hospital for the Insane in Tuscaloosa. Hospital records confirm she was admitted on September 3, 1858, diagnosed with religious mania and a breakdown of moral judgment. The doctor who admitted her noted that she arrived extremely agitated, claiming that agents of Satan had messed with her divine mission. Elizabeth Callaway stayed in the hospital until she died in January 1859, just 4 months after being admitted. The hospital's death records list brain fever as the cause, though modern medical historians think it could have been all kinds of things: meningitis, a stroke, or just the physical toll of a severe mental breakdown. She was buried in an unmarked grave on the hospital grounds, which was the normal thing to do when a patient's family didn't claim the body. Thomas Callaway got to Prattville in February to settle his aunt's estate. According to local stories, he stayed at the Prescott Plantation instead of the Callaway Mansion, and he only visited the mansion once, along with the sheriff and a few workmen. After that visit, he ordered the mansion to be boarded up tight and the entrances to the underground rooms sealed off with brick and mortar. He sold the land off piece by piece to the neighboring plantation owners for way below what it was worth on one condition: that the mansion itself be left alone and never lived in. We don't know what Thomas saw during that one visit to the mansion. There's no written record of what he thought, and he never talked publicly about his aunt or what she'd done. The only clue we have comes from a letter he wrote to his wife back in Boston, where he simply says, "The family name has been stained by associations I dare not commit to paper. I have done what I can to ensure that the evil ends here. Some secrets are best left buried, and I pray that what lies beneath the Callaway land remains undisturbed for all time." The Callaway Mansion sat empty for decades, slowly falling apart as nature took it back. By the time of the Civil War, people were already calling it a crumbling monument to forgotten sins. Local folks avoided the property, saying it was haunted by the spirits of people who had suffered under its floors. Parents warned their kids to stay away from the old Callaway place, though barely anyone could actually say what had happened there, since the people who knew the truth had deliberately kept it hidden. It wasn't until the civil rights movement of the 1960s brought new attention to the history of slavery and resistance that historians started piecing together the story of Elizabeth Callaway and her underground rooms. The 1965 archaeological dig, done as part of a bigger study of underground railroad sites, uncovered physical proof that backed up a lot of the oral history that had mostly been passed down within the Black communities of Autauga County. But even now, the full truth of what happened at the Callaway Mansion between 1850 and 1858 is still hard to pin down. Was Elizabeth Callaway a mentally ill woman whose good intentions, helping enslaved people escape to freedom, twisted into a god complex that led her to lock people up and even kill? Or was she a cruel person from the very start, using the cover of abolition to satisfy darker urges? The historical record just doesn't give us a clear answer. What is clear is this: under the floorboards of an Alabama mansion, a woman built a space that broke every moral rule of her time, not by helping enslaved people go free like she may have first intended, but by building her own private world where she had total control over the people she claimed to be saving. In doing that, she created a nightmare that was quieter but just as horrifying as the slavery system itself. The land where the Callaway Mansion once stood is now part of a nature preserve outside Prattville. Most visitors to the area have no idea about the property's history and wouldn't guess, looking at the peaceful grove of oak trees that's grown over the old foundation, that such darkness once lived there. Still, local historians say that metal detector hobbyists and amateur diggers occasionally find things in the surrounding fields: buttons, coins, and small personal items that may have belonged to the people who passed through Elizabeth Callaway's sanctuary. Maybe the most haunting find of all happened during a drought in 1954, when the creek along what used to be the eastern edge of the Callaway property dried up completely. In the dried-up creek bed, a local fisherman found a small tin box with a handwritten note inside. The paper had mostly rotted away, but preservation work managed to save a bit of the writing. It read, "If these words are found, know that we lived. We were 15 souls beneath the widow's floor. We called for help each night. Remember us." The note wasn't signed, and attempts to figure out when it was written or whose handwriting it was have never turned up an answer. Today, the story of Elizabeth Callaway and her underground rooms lives in that gray area between real documented history and regional folklore. Some scholars brush off the more shocking details as exaggerations, the kind people make up when they turn the unknown into monsters. Others argue that the physical evidence, combined with the written records that still exist, paint a picture of human cruelty that doesn't need any exaggeration to be horrifying. What can't be denied is that in the years before the Civil War, at a mansion outside Prattville, Alabama, something happened that was so disturbing that an entire community worked together to erase it from public memory. The widow who claimed to be following God's guidance built a hidden world beneath her home, and the people who ended up in that world found themselves trapped in a twisted version of salvation, one that, for many of them, became a prison they could only escape through death. The cracks in the foundation, noted so plainly in the 1859 county records, hid a much deeper crack in the human soul, a darkness that still echoes for anyone who knows where to listen for its whispers. The land has since been built over, and the mansion has long since turned to dust. But some say that on quiet summer nights, when the moon is new and darkness covers the old Callaway property, you can still hear voices not crying out in pain or fear, but singing hymns in a language no local can recognize. Whether these are the voices of the dead, wanting someone to acknowledge what they suffered, or just the wind moving through the hollow spaces still under the ground, only the people who hear them can decide. The story of the widow Callaway and her underground sanctuary is still one of Alabama's most disturbing historical footnotes, a reminder that evil often wears the mask of kindness, and that the road to hell really can be paved with intentions that started out good. In the messy moral world of pre-Civil War America, Elizabeth Callaway built her own twisted little universe, one where salvation and imprisonment became impossible to tell apart, and freedom always stayed just out of reach. Some of the most convincing evidence about Elizabeth Callaway's sanctuary comes from a collection of items found during the 1965 archaeological dig. Hidden under a loose floorboard in what used to be Elizabeth's private study, researchers found a tin box holding several items that give us a glimpse into the widow's mind and into the experiences of the people kept beneath her home. Among these items was a small leather journal that didn't belong to Elizabeth, but to a woman identified only as M. Historians think this may have been written by a woman named Miriam, who's listed in the Callaway Plantation records as a house slave bought in 1845. The journal, just 12 pages long, appears to have been written while she was locked in the underground rooms. The handwriting is shaky, which suggests it was written in poor light or by someone in physical pain. Most entries aren't dated, but mentions of the changing seasons suggest the journal covers at least a full year. One passage reads, "The mistress comes at night with scripture on her tongue and shadows in her eyes. She talks about salvation while the chains around my ankles just get tighter. 3 more people arrived yesterday, brought down blindfolded and crying. She tells them this is the road to freedom, but there is no road here, only rooms that lead to more rooms, all locked from the outside." Another entry describes what the space actually looked like. "We hear the house above us, footsteps like thunder over our heads. Air comes through little pipes in the walls, her design, she says proudly, made just to keep us breathing. But there's never enough air, it's never fresh, and it's always heavy with our fear and sickness. Some rooms connect through crawl spaces so narrow that only the children can fit through them. They become our messengers, the only way we know who else is suffering down here besides us." The most disturbing entry seems to be one of the last ones she wrote. "Nathaniel died in the night, the 3rd one this month. His body stays with us like the others did until even the mistress can't stand the smell anymore when she comes on her rounds. She says their souls have graduated from her earthly school. She talks about their deaths with pride like it fulfills her purpose instead of condemning her. I have hidden this journal, hoping someday someone will know we existed." If you read these words, remember that we had names, dreams, families. Remember that we were here. Also in the tin box was a hand-drawn map of the underground rooms, labeled in what looks like Elizabeth's handwriting. The rooms were given Bible names: Gethsemane, Jericho, Eden, Golgotha, with notes about what each room was used for. Some were labeled instruction or reflection, while others had darker labels like correction and purification. The most troubling one was a small room simply labeled transition, which archaeological evidence suggests was where people who died in captivity were kept before being buried. A third item in the box gives maybe the most chilling look into Elizabeth's twisted worldview. It's a carefully hand-copied piece of a sermon with no author listed, but it was probably from a text Elizabeth brought with her into isolation. The passage, underlined heavily in several places, reads, "True mercy sometimes requires confinement of the body to allow salvation of the soul. As a parent restricts a child's movement to prevent harm, so must the shepherd sometimes pen the flock for protection from wolves they are too innocent to fear. The highest form of love is that which denies immediate comfort for eternal salvation." In the margin, Elizabeth had written, "My justification, they will understand in heaven what they resist on earth." The archaeological dig also showed how the underground complex worked as its own self-contained little world. Air vents disguised as garden decorations gave a small amount of fresh air. A pretty advanced drainage system carried waste away from where people lived, though it clearly wasn't big enough for the number of people trapped down there. The most clever and most disturbing part was a set of speaking tubes that let Elizabeth talk from her private study straight into each underground room. That let her check on and talk to her prisoners without ever having to go down among them, unless she chose to. Historians have been puzzled for decades by one question: how could Elizabeth Callaway, a woman with no training in building or architecture, have designed and built such a complicated structure? The answer might lie in the disappearances from the early years of her widowhood. The surveyor, the mason, and the carpenter who were reported missing may have been forced to use their skills to build the underground complex, and then became its first permanent prisoners. This theory is backed up by markings found on the inside walls of the rooms during the dig. In one room, partly covered up by later chalk marks, researchers found writing that said, "Martin Cowpermith, Mason, Charleston, began work September 12, 1850. Imprisonment commenced November 23." No historical record of a Mason by that name has ever turned up in Charleston's records, though a Martin Cowpermith is mentioned in an 1849 Charleston Mercury newspaper ad offering skilled masonry work for fancy homes. The complex under the Callaway Mansion is one of the most twisted ironies of the pre-Civil War South, a structure supposedly built to free enslaved people that instead became a different kind of prison. It wasn't built for money or racist ideas, but by a warped religious vision, which might be even scarier since it may have started from genuine, good-hearted concern. Elizabeth Callaway's change from grieving widow to Messiah-like captor didn't happen in a bubble. Historical context suggests a few things may have added to her mental decline. Her husband's death removed the social rules that had controlled her behavior as a plantation mistress. Her isolated rural Alabama estate meant no one was watching her actions closely. And the extreme moral contradictions of the pre-Civil War South, a culture that prided itself on Christian values while running a system of human slavery, gave her exact kind of delusion the perfect place to grow. The belief that true freedom could only come through a period of purification under her own personal spiritual guidance. Dr. Alina Whitman, a historian and psychologist who has studied the Callaway case a lot, suggests in her 1983 analysis that Elizabeth may have had what modern psychiatry would call bipolar disorder with psychotic features, made worse by the trauma of losing her husband and the moral struggle she felt as a slaveholder who was starting to lean toward abolition. The evidence suggests that Elizabeth Callaway began with genuine intentions to assist enslaved people in escaping north, Dr. Whitman writes. Her letters with known abolitionists in Ohio and Pennsylvania back up this idea. But as her mental state got worse, her Messiah-like delusions turned what might have been a stop on the Underground Railroad into something much darker, a private little kingdom, where she could play savior to prisoners who had no choice but to put up with her increasingly unpredictable behavior. This idea is backed up by how Elizabeth's journal entries change over time. Her early writing shows her wrestling with the morality of owning slaves after her husband's death. An entry from March 1850 reads, "I have prayed for guidance regarding the souls in my care. James believed their servitude was ordained by God, but I find myself unable to reconcile the teachings of Christ with the cries I hear from the quarters at night. There must be another path." By June of that same year, her wording quietly shifts. "I have received my calling. The Lord has shown me that I am to be the vessel through which salvation will flow. The path to freedom must begin with spiritual liberation, and I alone have been chosen to provide this guidance." This entry lines up with the start of the mansion renovations, which suggests that as the house was physically changing, so was its mistress psychologically. By 1852, her writing clearly shows delusional thinking. "They resist my teaching, ungrateful for the sacrifice I make in sheltering them from the corruption of the world. They do not understand that what they perceive as confinement is in fact the cocoon from which their souls will emerge transformed. I must be firm, even when their ingratitude wounds me deeply. This is the burden of the chosen." What makes the Callaway case so disturbing isn't just the suffering of the people locked under her home, it's how it shows just how thin the line can be between kindness and cruelty, between rescue and captivity. It seems Elizabeth Callaway believed, right up to her last day, that she was doing an act of Christian charity. The road to her own private hell really was paved with intentions that may have started out good. How the community reacted to the discoveries at the Callaway mansion also tells us a lot about how society worked in pre-Civil War Alabama. The choice to handle it all quietly, sending Elizabeth to an asylum instead of putting her on trial for kidnapping or murder, and splitting up her prisoners among other plantations instead of giving them the freedom she'd originally promised, shows what really mattered most to the plantation-owning class: keeping the system of slavery going no matter what. Jonathan Prescott, the neighboring plantation owner whose journal gives us most of what we know about these events from that time, wrote in October 1858, "The affair at the Seed Place has been resolved to the satisfaction of all parties concerned. The unfortunate lady's condition made any public accounting of events unnecessary and indeed undesirable. The peculiar nature of her delusion that she was providing a kind of liberation might plant dangerous ideas if widely discussed. Better that the entire matter be consigned to oblivion." This conspiracy of silence mostly worked. For almost 100 years, the story of Elizabeth Callaway and her underground sanctuary was mainly kept alive through spoken stories in the black communities of central Alabama, while white historians dismissed it as folklore, until the physical evidence found in the 1960s made it impossible to deny any longer. Maybe the saddest part of the Callaway story is what happened to the people who survived being locked up under the mansion. Historical records show that after they were found, the 12 people, 7 women, 3 men, and 2 children, were split up among neighboring plantations. Their names show up in property records: Mercy, Nathaniel, Sarah, Eliza, William, Joseph, Harriet, Rebecca, Samuel, Grace, and 2 children listed only as girl about 7 years old and boy about 10 years old. Of these 12 people, only Mercy can be tracked with any real certainty through later historical records. She shows up in the 1860 census as property of the Prescott Plantation, listed as a black female about 45 years old. After emancipation, the 1870 census lists her as Mercy Williams, 55, domestic servant, still living in Autauga County. This is the same Mercy who gave the 1937 interview, one of the earliest first-hand accounts we have of life under the Callaway mansion. In that interview, given when she would have been well over 90 years old, Mercy gives us a perspective that makes the story a lot more complicated. When asked about Elizabeth Callaway, she's quoted saying, "Miss Elizabeth started out wanting to do good. That's what makes it all so terrible. She would read to us from the Bible and tell us about the free states up north where black folks could live without masters. Some did get sent north in the beginning. We would help prepare them, get them ready for the journey, teach them what they needed to know to survive, but then something changed in her. Her eyes got a strange light. She started seeing visions, talking about angels giving her instructions. That's when the doors got locked. That's when the help became a prison." This balanced view, recognizing Elizabeth's good intentions at the start while still condemning the horror that followed, is maybe the fairest way to look at the Callaway case. It shows a tragedy with no real villains, only victims, and in a way that even includes Elizabeth herself, a woman whose moral awakening got twisted by mental illness and the poisonous world of the slave-holding South. The Callaway case stands as a dark chapter in Alabama's history, but it's also a warning about the dangers of thinking you're a messiah and about how power, even when it starts out with good intentions, can corrupt a person. Absolutely. Elizabeth Callaway started out questioning whether slavery was moral and ended up building her own private system of captivity, justified by her own personal religion that put her in the role of savior. The story also shows just how messy the moral world of the pre-Civil War South really was, where even acts that looked like resistance against slavery could get twisted by the very same logic of ownership and control that slavery itself was built on. Elizabeth rejected the economic excuse for slavery, only to replace it with a spiritual one, trading one kind of bondage for another, while still holding onto total power over people. As for the Callaway mansion itself, nature has long since taken the site back. The last standing wall fell down during a storm in 1943, and today only the stone foundation and a few scattered bricks show where the house used to stand. The entrances to the underground rooms, sealed up so carefully by Thomas Callaway back in 1859, have never been reopened. Ground scanning radar surveys done in 1998 confirmed the spaces are still down there, now partly flooded and impossible to get into. Local attitudes about the site have changed over time. Once avoided as a place of bad luck, the old Callaway property now has a small plaque marking its historical importance, though the wording only vaguely mentions activities connected to the Underground Railroad. There have been proposals for a more detailed historical marker that would tell the full story of Elizabeth Callaway and her prisoners, but it's controversial. Some local historians think the site should be preserved as a reminder of a dark chapter in Alabama's past, while others think the memory of Elizabeth's victims would be better honored by just letting their place of suffering fade back into the landscape. What can't be erased, though, is what this story teaches us about history. The Callaway case reminds us that moral choices in the past were rarely as clear-cut as they might look now, that human motives are complicated and often contradictory, and that the same heart can hold both great kindness and terrible cruelty. For people who study the Underground Railroad and resistance to slavery, the Callaway mansion is a dark counterpoint to the usual stories of heroic abolitionists and daring escapes. It's a reminder that not everyone who claimed to offer shelter did so without demanding a terrible price of their own. In the end, maybe the best way to honor the people who suffered under the Callaway mansion isn't a physical marker, but simply committing to remember their story, to admit that behind the neat, cleaned-up versions of history are real, complicated human experiences of hope, betrayal, resistance, and endurance. The voices that once sang hymns in the dark under that Alabama plantation house may be silent now, but their echo remains for anyone willing to listen to the uncomfortable truths they have to teach us about our shared past. As the sun sets over what used to be the Callaway Plantation, casting long shadows over the overgrown foundation stones, you might imagine those underground rooms still filled with the spirits of the people who lived and died there. Not as ghosts exactly, but as memory itself, refusing to disappear from a place that's seen both the worst and the best of human nature. Their story, once nearly lost to history, now stands as proof of how strong the human will to survive can be, even in the darkest circumstances, and as a warning about how easily a wish to do good can turn corrupt once it's paired with total power. The last known mention of Elizabeth Callaway comes from a worker at the Alabama State Hospital for the Insane, who wrote in his personal diary in January 1859, "The widow passed today, still clutching the small Bible she would not relinquish even in her most violent episodes. She took her true intentions to the grave with her, leaving behind only questions that still echo through the chambers she built, chambers that, like her twisted vision of salvation, promised light but only delivered deeper darkness." Those chambers under the Callaway mansion, now silent and sealed off from anyone, remain a real physical example of one of history's most disturbing ironies, a place built in the name of freedom that ended up becoming one of the most complete forms of captivity. A sanctuary that was also a prison, dreamed up out of compassion but carried out with cruelty. A dark mirror of the bigger moral contradiction that was the whole pre-Civil War South. Her last words, spoken clearly after days of confused mumbling, were, "They are waiting for me below." Whether that was one final clear-headed moment of guilt, or just one more part of her delusion, nobody can say. And so the story of the widow who hid enslaved people beneath her mansion takes its place among the complicated stories of American history. Not a simple tale of heroism, and not a simple tale of villainy either, but a reminder of how thin the line can be between salvation and suffering, and how easily people can convince themselves that cruelty is kindness when they believe they've been chosen by God to decide someone else's fate. The land where the Callaway mansion once stood keeps slowly returning to wilderness, the physical traces of people ever having lived there disappearing bit by bit under creeping vines and fallen leaves. But the story keeps getting passed down from generation to generation, a whispered warning about the dangers of self-righteousness without humility, and about just how dark the human spirit can get, even while believing it's following the light of God's guidance. Because in the end, the real horror of the Callaway case isn't just the physical conditions of the underground rooms, or even the suffering of the people locked inside them. It's the realization that evil often wears the face of kindness, and that hell can be built by people who truly believe they're building heaven on earth. That's the legacy of the widow's sanctuary, a cautionary tale that still haunts a nation that's still struggling to make its highest ideals match up with its darkest chapters. In words credited to Mercy Williams from her WPA interview, "Miss Elizabeth taught me something I never forgot. She taught me that when somebody claims they're saving you, first thing you should ask is, saving you from what? And saving you for whom? 'Cause sometimes the rescue is just another kind of cage with bars you can't even see until it's too late." A lesson paid for in suffering, passed down through time, the final, unintended gift from the widow who created a sanctuary that was also a prison, beneath the floorboards of a mansion in Alabama.